It's really great to be back here in Denmark. I had a really wonderful time with this group last year, and when they asked me to come back, I didn't hesitate. So I want to thank Frank and Carol and Peter and Lucas and the whole team for putting this together again and continuing to grow every year, from their humble beginnings 2 years ago to this wonderful venue that we have here today. So the subject of my talk is, you could say, it kind of evolved out of what we talked about last year. And it evolved partially because there were a lot of questions that I had in my own mind, a lot of things I wanted to understand better myself. It also evolved out of this kind of question that kept being raised as to, well, why is this important? Why are you putting so much focus on this? Why do we need to know this? Take me down just a little bit. And so these are all very good questions and very valid questions. Why do we want to focus on what amounts to a lot of obscure American political history? Why is it relevant? Well, what I'm going to do is take you on a little journey today. And I'll let you determine for yourselves whether or not you feel it's relevant. But I think that what we're looking at here is a story that has been, fairly well hidden. But once we pull it out from the darkness and shake it off a bit and put it out for people, we start to see, wow, I can see what these relevancies are. So the topic is, are we all one? The engineering and management of movements and alternative cultures. We will look at the following theses in this presentation. The first is, and the most important, is this one right here. There are multiple stages to this waking up process, in my personal experience and in my humble point of view. That there is a kind of a big awakening process that happens when we get out of the dominant culture. We have that Matrix Unplugged moment that everybody talks about. We realize that corporate consumerism is a cancer that's eating the planet and that we want to live differently. And as Frank presented in the opening, we had this idea, the notion of the normal person, and then there was the conspiracy person, the conscious person, and the spiritual person. Okay, so that either conspiracy person or spiritual person exists in what I like to look at as the second level of awakening. And it's only one of many levels, just like when we go to sleep at night, we go down through our alpha wave sleep, and then through our gamma wave sleep, and then delta sleep, and ultimately down into theta sleep, where the most healing is done. So in the reverse process coming up, where we are now is kind of like in the liminal zone between being truly awake and being back asleep. And what I'm going to do is endeavor to explain that. And so the way I'm going to do that is by pointing out that to change the future or to do anything about it, we have to first appropriately and correctly understand the past, at least as best as we can. But the problem with this, and this is a problem that's pervasive, and we've been dealing with this for many, many years, is that by some estimates, 90% of what we're looking at in this world is hidden from us. It's classified, top secret, hidden away in vaults, in computer systems, where we can't get our eyes on it. And so over time, because this is a system that's only been around for about 60-some years, in the current state it's in now, the post-World War II era, in that time we've had leaks, we've had whistleblowers, we've had documents come out, we've had all kinds of controlled, limited hangouts and types of controlled releases. But we've been able to start piecing together larger patterns of things. However, much of the rest of that is polluted by active disinformation efforts. And some of them are pretty out there. And so, to navigate covert history, it requires us to have equal parts evidence-based research and investigation. What documents do we have? What evidentiary trail do we have? Deductive reasoning, common sense, and we also have to have the freedom of speculation. So in the places where we have to make speculative leaps, we need to foster an environment where that is okay. Just like in the world of scientific inquiry. When we are trying to find the answer for something, we need to test the theory and test the hypothesis. Unfortunately, what we live in is a culture that doesn't allow us to test these hypotheses without ridiculing us terribly and trying to scare us away from all of this. So, finally, the subject of this presentation is that I would posit to you that most, if not all, of the major Western cultural and political movements of the last 100 years have either been engineered or they've been thoroughly infiltrated, redirected, and ultimately neutralized. So I'm going to take you on a little journey through history. This is a little 15-minute film I put together for the purposes of this presentation, so make yourselves comfortable, and we'll see you on the other side.
There's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
That the Negro will be serving notice that no longer does he believe in turning the other cheek and being the constant victim of someone else's brutality.
As President Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible only make violent revolution inevitable.
This nation is in a state of turmoil perhaps unparalleled in our history. Poverty amidst wealth, widespread racism, and bewilderment over a strange war are the seeds of the revolution.
The revolution has come.
Nurturing these seeds are a coalition of dedicated revolutionaries working to exploit our weaknesses for the ultimate destruction of the United States system of government as we know it.
These racist Gestapo pigs have to stop brutalizing our community, or we're going to take up guns, we're going to drive them out.
If you look back at it and see a bunch of crazy young people roaming around trying to tell people that the revolution is coming, it seems totally insane. And in some ways it was totally insane, but it fit into a period of revolution in the whole world.
We're in a revolution. Don't ever say we're going into a revolution. We're in a revolution. Now the question is, who's going to win it?
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
We were targeted, bam, 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 by a very sophisticated, advanced counterintelligence program, at the same time by very crude and violent police.
This pattern of harassment is going on against the Black Panther Party across the country. On Friday, the Watts office of the Black Panther Party was bombed and demolished. Last week, the Des Moines office was bombed. They can't stop anything we're doing as a legitimate political organization, so they come in and shoot us and shoot tear gas in our office and drag people off to jail like they've lost their minds.
Because we don't think that people that found...
He was a wonderful speaker, and every time he would speak in Chicago, there would be huge crowds, and he inspired people tremendously, and I believe that's why he had to be killed by the United States.
In Chicago today, 2 Black Panthers were killed as police raided a Panther stronghold.
Police arrived at Fred Hampton's West Side apartment at 4:45 this morning. They had a search warrant authorizing them to look for illegal weapons. The state's attorney's office says that Hampton and another man were killed in the 15-minute gun battle which followed.
The documents, which were leaked anonymously to the press, revealed the existence of COINTELPRO, a secret FBI program to destroy a wide range of groups that opposed the U.S. government. The Black Panthers, the anti-war movement, even Martin Luther King.
What we're thinking about is a peaceful planet. We're not thinking about anything else. We're not thinking about any kind of power. We're not thinking about any of those kind of struggles. We're not thinking about revolution or war or any of that. That's not what we want. Nobody wants to get hurt. Nobody wants to hurt anybody. We would all like to be able to live an uncluttered life, a simple life, a good life, you know, and like think about moving the whole human race ahead a step or a few steps.
There is a bit of acid sickness going around. There's somebody out there. There's something. You don't need that. Let's not pass anything to anybody else tonight. Let's just hang together. Anything that could be dangerous, let's just forget about it. Let's just make the festival, not the other stuff. With all of this, ain't nothing can make you high as this.
To get back to the warning that I've received, you may take it with however many grains of salt you wish, that the brown acid that is circulating around us is not specifically too good. It's suggested that you do stay away from that. Of course, it's your own trip, so be my guest, but please be advised that there is a warning on that one, okay?
Go ahead, would you repeat that again?
Greetings to the people and fellow comrade brothers and sisters. My name is Sin Q, and to my comrades I am known as Sin. I hold the rank of General Field Marshal in the United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army. The SLA has arrested the subject for the crimes that her mother and father have by their actions committed against we the American people and the oppressed people of the world.
All of a sudden the answer was there.
There's some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened to them in their whole life.
Some people see a great deal of God in my body. They see Christ in me, a hope of glory.
He was taking drugs. He was getting more and more paranoid.
I think the only way he can survive and sustain what he started is to isolate all his followers from this country and from their families.
are truth, you are love, you are bliss, you are freedom.
Well, everybody's always asked me about her, you know, what kind of girl is she? She seems like a real bitch. Oh, she must be very aggressive and pushy.
We have arrested Mark David Chapman of 55 South Kukui Street, Hawaii, for the homicide of John Lennon.
But if you take for one case that we have in the Disclosure Project, and that's a man who was the senior guy at the FAA, and they were tracking this object over Alaska, and it was at one point in the sky, and in one sweep of the radar, it would be 40, 50 miles away, moving completely non-linearly, not like an airplane.
رئيس الجمهورية.
Okay, there's a lot there. That was a journey through most of the major social and political movements of the last 50 years. The supposition I put to you today is that every one of those was infiltrated on some level or another by government intelligence forces, police, military. Some of them were actually completely engineered for very specific purposes. And many of the key figures that you saw in this presentation were all connected through one very unique program. So the problem, well, this is in quotes because it's not necessarily per se a problem for everybody. we're going to start looking at the psychology of revolution. Controlling the angry mob in the age of mass democracy. So this gentleman right here, Mr. Sigmund Freud, this is Mr. Vladimir Lenin, of course. You probably recognize both of those guys. They kind of look alike, too, don't they? Beard, baldness, serious look, you know, architecture. So Freud and his nephew, his American nephew, Edward Bernays, are responsible for the creation of this idea of consumerism, public relations, which is just the American version of propaganda, and what we call the manufacturing of consent and the manipulation of desire. This means that these people were able to convince you that you needed or wanted something that you didn't actually need or want, and that you had to have this thing, whether it was a car or a piece of clothing or a piece of technology, in order to feel fulfilled as a human being. This gentleman and his nephew figured out the way to exploit all of us, and they created what's known as consumerism and advertising to support that. It was all based on this idea that Freud said that humanity was governed by dark urges that, if left unchecked, would lead to chaos and social disorder. And that the popular uprisings of the time, which began with World War I, went into the Russian Revolution, and then ultimately the Great Depression, did indeed strike terror into the hearts of the ruling elite. Going to, if we can get the lights down again, this is another clip from a BBC documentary by a gentleman named Adam Curtis. And this is called The Century of the Self.
100 years ago, a new theory about human nature was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and societies to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try and control the dangerous crowd in an age of mass democracy. At the heart of the story is not just Sigmund Freud, but other members of the Freud family. This episode is about Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays. Bernays is almost completely unknown today, but his influence on the 20th century was nearly as great as his uncle's. Because Bernays was the first person to take Freud's ideas about human beings and use them to manipulate the masses. He showed American corporations for the first time how they could make people want things they didn't need by linking mass-produced goods to their unconscious desires. Out of this would come a new political idea of how to control the masses. By satisfying people's inner selfish desires, one made them happy and thus docile. It was the start of the all-consuming self, which has come to dominate our world today. The publication of Freud's works in America had an extraordinary effect on journalists and intellectuals in the 1920s. What fascinated and frightened them was the picture Freud painted of submerged, dangerous forces lurking just under the surface of modern society. Forces that could erupt easily to produce the frenzied mob which had the power to destroy even governments. It was this they believed had happened in Russia. To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. The leading political writer, Walter Lippmann, argued that if human beings were in reality driven by unconscious, irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy. What was needed was a new elite who could manage what he called the bewildered herd. This would be done through psychological techniques that would control the unconscious feelings of the masses. The effect of the Wall Street crash on Europe was also catastrophic. It intensified the growing economic and political crisis in the new democracies. In both Germany and Austria, there were violent street battles between the armed wings of different political parties. Against this backdrop, Freud, who was suffering from cancer of the jaw, retreated yet again to the Alps. He wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents. It was a powerful attack on the idea that civilization was an expression of human progress. Instead, Freud argued, civilization had actually been constructed to control the dangerous animal forces inside human beings. What was implicit in Freud's argument was that the ideal of individual freedom, which was at the heart of democracy, was impossible. Human beings could never be allowed to truly express themselves because it was too dangerous. They must always be controlled and would thus always be discontent. And in America too, democracy was under threat from the force of the angry mob. The effect of the stock market crash had been disastrous. There was growing violence as an angry population took out their frustration on the corporations who were seen to have caused this disaster. Then, in 1932, a new president was elected who was also going to use the power of the state to control the free market. But his aim was not to destroy democracy, but to strengthen it. And to do this, he was going to develop a new way of dealing with the masses.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power.
So, we cannot stress enough how important this was to the ruling elite at the time. This idea that they could be dragged from their homes at any given point by an angry mob, strung up, killed, and everything that they owned redistributed to the poor was of great concern. It started an entire global movement to control human behavior. Here's some of just a few of a billion historical points on this. So the idea of behavioral science was first established in England in the late 1800s. It was pioneered at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Germany. The Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was one of the first set up in 1921 to study literally the breaking point of humans. How far can the human psyche go before it? And then, of course, I can't stress this one enough, but after World War II, the United States Department of Defense secretly imported many of the top German Nazi and Italian fascist scientists and spies into the United States via South America and the Vatican under Vatican passports, usually dressed as priests. It was called the Rat Lines. The code name for this operation was Project Paperclip. Okay. So, there are a number of converging factors that were going on. Okay, so we have this Russian Revolution, then we get into World War I. Freud writes Civilization and Its Discontents, and he's starting to think that humanity is hopeless. And then we get the Great Depression, and then we get World War II, and it just gets worse, and it gets worse, and it gets worse. But the same group of people, the same social engineers and behavioral scientists, are still concerned with how do we control society. This next clip is from a film, The Net, the Unabomber, LSD, and the Internet. It gives a little bit more background on something that we'll go into a little bit later in the presentation.
All das gehört offensichtlich zu einem System, dessen Konturen ich erst erahne. Anscheinend ein geniales Feedback-System, das jeden Angriff und jede Störung umgehend als Energiezufuhr für seine weitere Perfektionierung nutzt. Wer braucht so etwas? Wer denkt sich so etwas aus? Zwischen 1946 und 1953 treffen sich im New Yorker Beekman Hotel auf Einladung der Joshua Macy Foundation führende Wissenschaftler verschiedener Fachgebiete. Unter anderem Norbert Wiener, Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Kurt Lewin und John von Neumann. Ziel dieser später Macy Konferenzen genannten vertraulichen Treffen, an denen gelegentlich Beamte der CIA teilnehmen, ist eine Wissenschaft, die Vorhersage und Kontrolle menschlichen Verhaltens möglich macht. Das ist eine Waffe, die Amerika auf dem neuen Schlachtfeld des Unterbewussten im Kalten Krieg dringend braucht. Aufmerksam registriert die Macy-Gruppe deshalb die 1950 erschienene Studie Die autoritäre Persönlichkeit des International Institute of Social Research, eine Neugründung des Frankfurter Instituts für Sozialforschung um Max Horkheimer und Theodor W. Adorno. Die Studie ist das bisher umfassendste Sozialprofil einer Gesellschaft der USA und soll eine wissenschaftliche Erklärung für religiöse und rassistische Vorurteile liefern. Aus Tausenden von Interviews entsteht eine riesige Datensammlung, die durch modernste Computer ausgewertet wird und vor allem auf eine Frage Antwort geben soll. Wie kommt es zu autoritärem Verhalten als Massenphänomen? Die Ursache sehen die Autoren in der autoritären Matrix des Menschen, die den Schlüssel zur Psychologie des Faschismus und totalitärer Systeme überhaupt bietet. Diese Matrix bildet sich durch Erziehung und Tradition und ist scheinbar unauflösbar verbunden mit der metaphysischen Vorstellung von einer übernatürlich geschaffenen Natur. Wie konnte man die Anfälligkeit für Faschismus und Rassismus, speziell gegen Juden, gezielt aufspüren und nachweisen? Dafür konstruieren die Soziologen eine Skala zur Messung des faschistischen Potenzials, die sogenannte F-Skala. Darüber hinaus sollen mit neuesten psychologischen Verfahren, zum Beispiel den Tests des amerikanischen Psychologen Henry A. Murray, einem der Väter der heutigen Assessment Center, bisher verborgene Tendenzen der Persönlichkeit aufgespürt werden. Um Faschismus und Antisemitismus für immer zu verhindern, scheint es notwendig, die Natur des Menschen und dessen kulturelle Muster so zu verändern, dass diese autoritäre Matrix für immer verschwinden würde. Wie kann man unblutig und ohne Operation tief in die Persönlichkeit und das Bewusstsein von Menschen eindringen, um dieses dann gezielt zu verändern? Nach dem Gestaltpsychologen Kurt Lewin, einem Mitglied der Macy-Gruppe, müssen dafür zuerst die alten Werte und Gleichgewichte zerstört werden, um die Verhältnisse flüssig zu machen. Dann können neue Gleichgewichte und Werte etabliert werden. Diese müssen dann durch Selbstregulierung dauerhaft befestigt werden. Umerziehung soll in Selbstumerziehung übergehen. Das wird die Welt in eine postnationale, multiethnische Weltgesellschaft ohne festgeschriebene Grenzen verwandeln. Die erforderlichen Werkzeuge und Baupläne für diese neue Weltordnung glaubt die Macy-Gruppe anbieten zu können. Neue und schnellere Rechenmaschinen und kybernetische Modellwelten, mit denen alle Bereiche von Wissenschaft, Kultur und Politik kontrollier- und steuerbar erscheinen. Das verspricht auch die Programmierung neuer Menschen, anti-autoritärer Menschen nach Maß.
Okay, so let's retrace our steps for a second so we know exactly where this came from. So early capitalism creates this division between capital and labor. Most of the labor force is poor. In the United States, it's primarily immigrant. There's big clashes because the disparity of wealth is so large. It leads to the Russian Revolution and the overturning of the Tsar and part of the imperial order. In order to rein in this worldwide revolution, a war is launched. War is the single greatest organizing principle for a society. So World War I happens, all of a sudden everyone's factioned back into their particular countries, fighting each other. The war ends. There's a bit of a boom period, and then the Great Depression. And these social issues start again. And in order to stave them off a second time, and because the issues weren't cleaned up the first time with the First World War, we're now in a Second World War, except this one's even worse. Now we're looking at something like 50 to 60 million people dead, and you're looking at somewhere between 6 to 11 million people exterminated outright because of their ethnic, racial, or religious background. This was the consequence of this existential malaise, this sickness that the existentialist writers, that Freud and Nietzsche and all of these people were writing about in this period, this industrial period, which is that we had lost our God, science had taken away our miracles, we were rudderless and aimless, and we were just kind of drifting through our own existence. And so in a sense, we were destroying ourselves because we had nothing to live for. And so these people come out in the wake of the Holocaust, and they're trying to figure out how to get past this. How do we stop doing this to each other? And the real key was in this idea, the creation of a post-national, multi-ethnic, global society with no fixed borders. Remember that phrase. It's going to come back a little bit later. So really what happened was that out of this horror of this period, these elite class got together and they decided, how are we going to essentially engineer out this authoritarian fascist impulse that is in human beings? Some of the key members were the Macy Group and the Frankfurt School, the International Institute for Social Research. Peace would be achieved through self-regulation, accomplished only by breaking down all the barriers between peoples, making us all one. Okay? And the two main tools for this, as we will see, this mode of social control, are psychology and technology, which combine into a theory that's known as cybernetics. Okay, this book was published in 1951 by this gentleman, Bertrand Russell. It's called The Impact of Science on Society. He was the kind of progenitor to this idea of cybernetics. And he goes on to write, as you can see, that the subject that he thinks will be of the most importance politically is mass psychology. And its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time, anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. He concludes with this morning, although this science will be diligently studied, it will be rigidly confined to the governing class. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. In other words, you're not going to be allowed to know why you believe in the things that you believe in. You're just going to think that it's a natural belief that you hold. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. Okay. Part 2. The engineering part. Cultural Marxism and the creation of the counterculture. Okay, so a couple of things are coming into collusion here. One of them is the Cold War, which was this paradigm-shifting event where these two polar sides of the capitalist model were fighting each other for supremacy. And it was also one of the largest economic engines of the last 500 or 600 years. It was a gigantic money-making venture for a certain class of people. Military, technology, information systems, production, all of that. But one of the key components of the Cold War, and one that isn't talked about very much, is what was known as the Cultural Cold War. The Cultural Cold War was simply this: if you have two cultures that are battling for supremacy in the world, their actual cultures, the appeal of their cultures, are going to be in competition with each other as well. So both the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc, the NATO bloc, poured millions and millions of dollars into creating art and literature and other culture, both of a high and of a pop culture nature, in order to market, sell, advertise their particular system. So this was the CIA program to recruit and support artists who would promote the idea that America was a sophisticated, culturally rich democracy. And then they created an organization called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a vast jamboree of intellectuals, writers, historians, poets, and artists, which was set up with CIA funds in the 1950s and run by a CIA agent. So one of the movements that was created, for example, is abstract expressionism. You know, Jackson Pollock and de Kooning and all of those guys came out of New York. And so they said, well, we hadn't really had an indigenous American art movement in a while, so let's create one. But we got to make sure, because most of the painters are all communists. So what do we got to do? Well, let's go get this drunk Jackson Pollock and this guy here, and let's, dumb the art down a little bit, and here we'll have our very own American style. Well, what is that called? Well, there's a term for it, and it's called cultural Marxism. It's essentially the steady standardization, or you could call it the dumbing down, of youth and culture, making them more permissive in the Brave New World model. So, if you remember what Bertrand Russell said in the previous quote, if you want to control a society, all you need is one generation of their kids. And you get in at the beginning and you program them from the very beginning to accept this system and not to rebel against it. And you take the standards and you start to lower them and lower them and lower them and lower them. What's the motive of this? So there will never be a repeat of the uprising from the educated, middle-class, politically conscious baby boomer generation, which was the generation around the world in the late 60s that rose up and started to demand a better world. As we saw in Japan, in France, in Mexico, in the United States, in Canada, in Angola, in the Congo, in Vietnam, in China, in Cuba, there were all of these uprisings. Okay. Also, this maxim of follow the money is paramount here, because this wasn't just, an idea that a few people had, a couple of eggheads sitting around a table. There were huge, multi-billion-dollar foundations involved in this movement, in social engineering. There were think tanks designed specifically for the evolution of behavioral modification and management, propaganda, mind control, ultimately. Some of those were geared towards creating these anti-authoritarian programs and these cybernetics programs. So some of them I mentioned here are, as we saw, Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research, the Tavistock Institute, Rockefeller Foundation, the RAND Corporation, and the Esalen Institute all played key roles. Universities like Harvard, Stanford, MIT, usually partnering with what's known as DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It's the research agency in the Pentagon. And their job is to go find interesting technology, steal the patent, steal the technology, take it underground for defense applications, and then bring it back out once they've thoroughly exploited it for those first. Okay. And of course, this gave rise, this Cold War, this cultural Cold War, this behavioral science that was emerging in the Cold War led to people like John Nash and the RAND Corporation and game theory. And this new kind of like revision of the main prevailing belief, which is that humans are not just governed by dark primal urges, but that they're also selfish. And that humans primarily only care about themselves and will only do for themselves if they have some kind of enlightened self-interest. So before we move on, cybernetics is the use of technology and psychology together to control. It's an approach for exploring regulatory system structures and the study of mechanical, physical, biological, cognitive, and other social systems. So cybernetics became pretty important in the 1980s when computer technology started to move into the home. And so some of these pioneering ex-hippies, Steve Jobs, who founded Apple, Paul Allen, who's the co-founder of Microsoft, Stuart Brand, who formed the Whole Earth Catalog, these were all former hippies, former psychedelic warriors who got together and knew that there was a internet. It was called DARPANET or ARPANET. It was developed during the Cold War as the first internet system so that the United States could communicate, its military bases could communicate in the event of a nuclear war. And then over time, it eventually was released to the public and it became the internet and the World Wide Web. This guy, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was also involved in cybernetic research at Harvard. And we'll find out later that he was also involved in something else at Harvard. Okay, so there's another clip from another Adam Curtis documentary. It's called The Trap, and this is looking at game theory and this emergence of this new idea of the selfish human.
We will benefit our fellow men most if we are guided solely by the striving for gain. For this purpose, we have to return to an automatic system which brings this about, self-directing automatic system which alone can restore the liberty and prosperity. That is my fundamental conception.
Isn't it a philosophy based essentially on selfishness? What about altruism? Where does that come in?
It doesn't come in.
Hayek's ideas were dismissed by politicians and economists. The notion that one could create social order in a modern complex world simply by unleashing individual self-interest was seen as a failed and discredited idea. But proof that he might be right was about to emerge from the most unlikely of sources, from scientists struggling with the new, terrifying uncertainties of the Cold War. Underlying game theory was a dark vision of human beings who were driven only by self-interest, constantly distrustful of those around them. And there was a mathematician at the Rand Corporation who would take this dark vision much further. He set out to show that one could create stability through suspicion and self-interest, not just in the Cold War, but in the whole of human society. He was the mathematical genius, John Nash. Nash was portrayed in the Hollywood film A Beautiful Mind as a tortured hero. In reality, Nash was difficult and spiky. He was notorious at Rand for inventing a series of cruel games. The most famous he called Fuck You, Buddy, in which the only way to win was to ruthlessly betray your game partner. Nash took game theory and tried to apply it to all forms of human interaction. To do this, he made the fundamental assumption that all human behavior was exactly like that involved in the hostile, competitive world of the nuclear standoff. That human beings constantly watched and monitored each other, and to get what they wanted, they would adjust their strategies to each other. In a series of equations for which he would win the Nobel Prize, Nash showed that a system driven by suspicion and selfishness did not have to lead to chaos. He proved that there could always be a point of equilibrium in which everyone's self-interest was perfectly balanced against each other. But the stability, the equilibrium, would only happen if everyone involved behaved selfishly. Because if they cooperated, the result became unpredictable and dangerous. A famous game was developed at Rand to show that in any interaction, selfishness always led to a safer outcome. It was called the prisoner's dilemma. There are many versions, but all of them involve two players having to decide whether to trust or to betray each other. Imagine you have stolen the world's most valuable diamond. You have agreed to sell it to a dangerous gangster. He offers to meet you to exchange the diamond for the money, but you think he may kill you. So instead, you tell him you will take it to a remote field and hide it, while at the same time, he must go to another field hundreds of miles away and hide the money. Then you will call him, and each will tell the other the hiding place. But just as you are about to make the call, you realize you could betray him. You keep the diamond, and then you go and get the money, while the gangster searches fruitlessly in an empty field. But at the very same moment, you realize that he is probably thinking the same thing, that he could betray you. You have no way of predicting how the other person will behave. That is the dilemma. But what Nash's equation showed was that the rational choice was always to betray the other person, because that way, at the worst, you got to keep the diamond, and at the best, you got both the diamond and the money. But if you trusted the other person, you ran the risk of losing everything, because he might betray you. It was called the sucker payoff. What the prisoner's dilemma expressed was the strange logic of the Cold War. The optimum solution, offering to get rid of all your weapons, provided the Russians did the same, could never happen, because you couldn't trust them not to cheat. So instead, you went for stability, created by a balance of dangerous weapons on both sides. And what Nash had done was to turn that into a theory of how the whole of society worked. It had enormous implications for politics, because it proved that one could have a society based on individual freedom that wouldn't degenerate into chaos. But the price of that freedom would mean a world in which everyone would have to be suspicious and distrustful of their fellow human beings.
The Nash equilibrium is important because one of the great fears of politics is that self-interest would lead to utter chaos. And what the Nash equilibrium suggests is that rational pursuit of self-interest, even in the face of implacable hostile enemies, will lead to a kind of an order in which all players agree upon the strategies that they're playing, and that those strategies make sense to them. But at the same time, it's also paranoid because it's the idea of a human being sitting alone in a room, being able to totally reconstruct their opponent. Their opponent is totally implacable, totally hostile, and bent on their destruction.
But there was a small problem with Nash's equations. They didn't seem to correlate with how human beings actually behave towards each other in the real world. When the prisoner's dilemma game was tested out on the secretaries of the RAND Corporation, none of them played the rational strategy. Instead of betraying each other, they always trusted each other and decided to cooperate. And what no one realized was that John Nash himself was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He had delusions in which he believed that those around him who wore red ties were communist spies, and that he was part of a secret organization that could save the world.
You don't want to admit that you are crazy. You see the other people as crazy, but you like to think of yourself as not crazy, as rational. So I thought there were some secret organizations of humans or secret beliefs among some categories of humans, and I thought I had some relation to that. I heard voices, and I ultimately realized that I didn't hear anything but something that I created in my own mind. I was talking to myself mentally.
So, imagine if your smartest Nobel Prize winning systems analyst is completely paranoid and comes up with a civilization guiding belief that human beings are these paranoid, self-interested creatures and that we are all trying to fuck one another before they fuck us. Now imagine what that does on a society-wide level. Imagine the psychosis that it starts to create. So you have this desire to create this new culture of anti-authoritarian people that will reject fascism, but also won't become fascists. And you have all of this effort placed into feeding the selfish, self-interested desires of humans, going to Freud. Well, they need sleep, they need sex, they need food, they need clothing, they need the basics, and if they have that, then they won't revolt. And Nash says, well, they're not going to revolt as long as they're all set against each other. So, you know, they won't have enough time to revolt because they'll be wondering what the person right around the corner is going to be doing to them. And so things start to happen in a very natural sense, too, and what ends up happening in the 1950s is that the world starts evolving, and so we have these places where the anti-colonial struggle starts in a pretty serious way. And so you've got the Algerians rejecting the French, and you've got the Vietnamese rejecting the French in Southeast Asia and Indochina. And back in the United States, you've got segregation going on. You got the Jim Crow laws, and those are starting to come apart. And so there's this awakening that happens as Americans start to realize that, okay, how can we go around telling everybody what to do and punishing other people for war crimes and for human rights violations when we're doing the same thing back at home? How does that work? Well, the large movements that were brought out by civil rights, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, all ultimately converged on this idea that America was an apartheid state. That radicalized a whole generation of young people that were born to these baby boom, or these greatest generation parents that had fought in this great war against fascism and against evil. And they had been told that they were on the side of justice and on the side of history, and so that they're Americans and that everything they stand for is truth, justice, and the American way. Except that right here, we're oppressing our own citizens. We're creating second-class citizenry, and the world sees this. So things start to change, and at the same time, the world's waking up. The student generation of this baby boom generation starts to realize that all of the same stuff is still going on that led to the last couple of world wars. There's still all of this covert stuff going on. There's wars going on everywhere, and everywhere where there's supposed to be a kind of anti-colonial liberation struggle is instead the two main powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, fighting it out through proxy wars. So they start protesting. Now, from the point of view of these cultural social engineers, if you're starting to create a new culture, right? So the first step is you start to create your own through this cultural Cold War paradigm. You flood all this money into these foundations, you recruit all these artists, you recruit these thinkers, these intellectuals, and they all start writing about capitalism as a good system. But that's not going to break down barriers, okay? So what we also see happening is that social values are changing, you know? It's no longer the conservative times of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. There's a whole sexual liberation movement, energy that's starting to percolate up. There's this political awakening going on. And then with the collapse of the old religious order, we also have new spiritual beliefs coming in. People exploring consciousness. And so there is this whole kind of revolution that's happening. Okay, well, let's take a look at it, and let's see what the net results of it were. A countercultural revolution, of course, would be a necessary second step if we were going to create a new culture. One where people are looking and acting like these prevailing philosophies that are guiding it, which is that they are selfish, primarily, and that they are self-interested, and that they are driven by their more primal urges. So what better way to harness that energy than to create this whole counterculture hippie revolution? Now, at the same time, China was going through another cultural revolution themselves. It was the antithesis in practice. It was not about liberating the individual and allowing everybody to define and create and design their own self. It was about conforming everyone to the exact same role. However, in the end result was the same. An entire culture shifted from one set of values to another in a very short period of time. And The Chinese Cultural Revolution was by force, or what we call hard power projection, and the countercultural revolution of the West was created by what we call soft power projection, or the power of attraction. Okay. And in this, okay, of course, the main thing is that values shift significantly, so now everyone can be whoever they want to be. And conformity is now self-imposed. It's not imposed by a prevailing class system or a government. You don't have Mao telling you that this is your belief and this is your thing. You can have your own belief and thing, but you'll end up getting into a self-reinforcing circle of self-imposed conformity, right? You want to be accepted in the group. So to be accepted in the group, you have to take on the group's values. And so people self-regulate. This is exactly what they wanted with cybernetics, was to give people a platform for self-regulation. And then, of course, because this is still capitalism, it created a whole bunch of new industries and markets. How many millions and millions of tie-dyed t-shirts have been sold, for example, okay? Now, here's where we take a big speculative leap. However, more and more information is coming out about this. And I can't tell you that I know exactly what happened here. All I can tell you is that some very strange stuff happened. And some very strange coincidences went down. And the culture that you and I all kind of rocked out to for most of our young years, the rock music of the era, well, most of it came from one area. It came from this small area in Hollywood known as Laurel Canyon. And most of the most famous rock stars that we know from this era, these leading figures in the counterculture, were also living in this area at the same time. And what happened was some very interesting phenomenon. The following is a little clip introducing this book, which I recommend everybody read, by the way, if you have a chance. The name of the book is Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by an author named Dave McGowan.
Weird Secrets Inside the Canyon. Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream, written by David McGowan, who was down there. It's quite a fascinating book. It's a look at a little niche in Hollywood land, greater Hollywood land, that begat an awful lot of the icons and stars and celebrities and trend setters of the 60s, 70s, 80s. It really, I mean, think about this. Laurel Canyon in the 1960s and early 70s was a magical place where a dizzying array of musical artists congregated to create much of the music that provided the soundtrack to those very turbulent times. Members of bands like the Byrds, the Doors, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Turtles, the Eagles, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Frank Zappa, and the Mothers of Invention, of course, Steppenwolf, CSN, Three Dog Night, and Love, along with such singer-songwriters as Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, James Taylor, and Carole King, lived together and jammed together in the bucolic community nestled in the Hollywood Hills. But there was a dark side to that scene as well, and that's captured in Dave McGowan's new book. Many didn't make it out of there alive. We never hear about those, of course, and many deaths remain shrouded in mystery to this very day. Far more integrated into the scene than most would like to admit was a guy by the name of Charles Manson, along with his murderous entourage. Also floating about the periphery were various political operatives, up-and-coming politicians, and intelligence personnel, the same sort of people who gave birth to many of the rock stars populating the canyon. And all the canyon's colorful characters, rock stars, hippies, murderers, and politicians, politicos to be more exact, happily coexisted alongside a covert military installation.
What we end up looking at now is what I like to call the theory of cultural intervention. So let's remind ourselves what was going on here. It was the late 60s. There were student revolts going all over the world. In the United States alone, there were major urban riots happening, something like 35 major urban riots between 1965 and 1969. We're talking Newark, Detroit, Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, large sections of these cities burning. The talk of armed revolt by Black Americans, by militant Black Americans, was becoming more and more loud. Okay, watching what happened, the French government collapsing at least 2 or 3 times, watching students being shot in Mexico, watching Japanese students being shot for demonstrating. There was a concerted effort to try to shift the energy in this culture, as this theory of cultural intervention will state, okay? So there's some people that actually firmly believe that everything that we understand to be about hippies was entirely engineered. I'm not entirely sure I believe that. I'm not entirely sure that's valid. But there is a couple of points that are absolutely key. So from the larger standpoint, we go back to Theodor Adorno, who's one of the main figures in the Frankfurt School, who was one of the main figures behind the authoritarian personality, that study that was done in the 50s, and one of the key promoters of this idea of cultural Marxism. And in particular, Adorno said modern music is geared towards the breakdown of order, beauty, form, and meaning, waging a war on all the elements with the intent of disorienting man's psyche and breaking down his worldview. So as this counterculture picks up steam in the 1960s, it's the music that drives it. Primarily the music. Why? Well, there's a lot of different reasons we can speculate on. Music touches a part of us that is not rational. It is not in our logic centers. It's in our emotive centers. It is an archetypal energy, so it moves us in ways that we're not used to being moved. It also can manipulate our emotions on a very powerful scale. Now, what we're looking at is a statistically improbable concentration of 60s rock stars who, as you'll see, all hail from elite military and intelligence families, okay? They all are living in Laurel Canyon within literally like a couple square miles, couple square kilometer space. Tiny little space in Hollywood. They're right next to a top secret military film studio called Lookout Mountain. And that this small group of supposed cultural radicals who were going against the very grain of American values were given unprecedented and unfettered access to mass media. Now, in that 15-minute long short film I showed you in the beginning, there was a little clip. Do you guys recognize early Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead? Right? That is from a CBS News profile. Like a main primetime news profile of the 60s counterculture and of the Grateful Dead in particular, where we have this idea of Jerry Garcia saying, hey, we're not interested in power, we're not interested in revolution, we're not interested in any of that stuff. Nobody wants to get hurt. We're just looking for a simple life, an uncluttered life. And so, with CBS, which you may or may not know, had a very, very strong relationship. The founder, Bill Paley, William Paley, was the director of the network, was very close with the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA. The CBS was known to harbor many CIA agents working for them under Project Mockingbird, which was the infiltration of the mass media by the CIA over a 50-year period in order to shape public opinion about everything. And so on this very influential CBS program, Morley Safer, who was on 60 Minutes for like 30 years, which is the highest rated television program in the United States for many decades, he goes and he interviews the Grateful Dead. Now all of a sudden there's this new message being promoted, okay? This new message is, hey man, politics are old and boring. This is all about me. And so this a hippie archetype emerges and it kills this radical archetype. Suddenly it's not cool to like be all plugged in and want to march and change the world. Now you just gotta kind of want to get together and have a huge concert, drop a lot of acid and fucking party, man. And so this begins the opening of the culture of narcissism, which leads to the me generation of the 1970s. This is highly specific because the culture of narcissism was crafted in order to feed these two primary philosophies, this idea that humans were driven by dark unconscious urges in their primal selves that needed to be fed, and that we were essentially selfish, self-interested creatures that would only do things for ourselves. Okay, the culture of narcissism was perfect for that because it's all about you, or I should say me. It's about me. I'm going to talk about me and my stuff. I'm working on myself. I don't need to worry about all of you. As long as I work on myself, then everything is going to be fine. And this is an attitude that evolved over time. Okay, just in case you were wondering, okay, what are some of these connections? Well, Jim Morrison's father was Admiral Stephen Morrison of the United States Navy, who was the officer who relayed to Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara that the Gulf of Tonkin incident had actually happened, that the United States had been fired upon by North Vietnam. It was a complete and total fabrication, and it ended up starting the Vietnam War. This is Jim Morrison's father who reported this, okay? Frank Zappa was the son of a mathematician and a chemist who worked in the defense industry. Papa John Phillips was the son of a retired Marine Corps officer, a captain who was involved in military intelligence. Stephen Stills was born to a military family, as was David Crosby. Comes from a very wealthy family. His father was Annapolis military intelligence. You got Jackson Brown. His father worked in the OSS, joined the CIA. Graham Parsons of the Flying Burrito Brothers. He's the son of a major, decorated military intelligence officer. Jimi Hendrix was in the Army while his father was stationed in Oklahoma. We believe in military intelligence. And then, of course, Michael Jeffrey, Jimi Hendrix's manager, who we'll revisit later, is a very dodgy figure that has connections to the CIA, MI6, and the Mossad, among others. And, of course, he was an informant for the FBI. Okay, so, and this is just some of the people that Dave McGowan covers in Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. There's many, many, many more, and all of them have this connection to military or intelligence families. So, now we get into what we call Part 3, Interdiction. COINTELPRO, MKUltra, Operation Chaos, and the Aquarian Revolution. Just in case you were curious, interdiction is a military term for the act of delaying, disrupting, or destroying enemy forces or supplies en route to the battle area. It's a term that's used very commonly in American political rhetoric about the war on drugs. We say interdiction efforts against drug traffickers are up 50% this month. And it just means that we went and shot 50% more people with big guns. Okay, so on to a happier topic, Nazis. So, MKUltra and intelligence. Well, in 1950, Project Bluebird was started. It was approved by the first director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, who is a well-known Wall Street lawyer and financier. Excuse me. Allen Dulles also, him and his brother, had significant investments in Nazi Germany during the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So did the Bush family, by the way. So did Brown Brothers Harriman, the Rockefellers, the Fords, and many other prominent American families, because they actually reconstructed Germany after World War I. They rebuilt German industry, they armed the German war machine, and they did not want to go into the war on the side of the British. That was a deal that Churchill and Roosevelt made. And that was essentially because they too were these two Fabian socialists who had their own versions of what the world should look like, fighting against these fascists, corporate and state interests wanting to come together. This is how the elite take out their problems on each other, okay? They create movements that change entire cultures. So in this case, Project Bluebird eventually became Artichoke in the Army, and then MKUltra in the CIA, and then it morphed into Project Monarch, okay? All of these guys here, yeah, that's all the Nazis that we rescued from Nuremberg and the hangman's noose, among other things. All of these guys should have been shot for being war criminals, but they weren't. They were spared. They came here, they went to the United States, not here, this is Denmark, I keep remembering. And they lived very, very comfortable lives. And they developed our rocket, our aerospace program for NASA, and they developed our military intelligence system. In fact, the head of the SS intelligence operation during the war, a guy named Reinhard Gehlen, never served any time, never saw the inside of a courtroom. Instead, he was put in charge of the West German secret police for the Federal Republic of Germany, and also set to the task of building the United States post-war military intelligence network, which eventually became known as Gladio, which we will get to in a moment. The purpose of Bluebird MKUltra was to discover means of conditioning people, to investigate the possibility of controlling individuals, what their memories were, what the limits of them were, and to find a defensive means for preventing hostile control. In other words, mind control. Mind control, mind control, mind control, mind control. And these were all the different areas that they were chartered, they were given license to use and funding to use. So they looked at radiation, electroshock, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, anthropology, the whole 9 yards. So a lot of people think that MKUltra is just about psychedelic drugs. It wasn't. And that's one of the interesting things I found out, was it really was more about all this, and in the end, when it morphed into Monarch, it became mostly about electromagnetic, microwave, radio frequency control, okay? A person that you want to look up for that is a writer named Alex Constantine, who actually I cite a couple of his books a little bit later. Okay, so MKUltra and chaos. Okay, so regarding psychedelic drugs, Richard Helms, who is the deputy director, revealed during the church hearings in 1975 that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in extensive testing and experimentation on all social levels. So the known compounds that they tested were this LSD, mescaline, various amphetamines, and then STP, DOB, and BZ. 3 synthetic psychedelics that BZ is known as the brown acid that they were talking about at Woodstock, which was intentionally dropped into Woodstock in order to create utter chaos, because it was a drug that isolated the aggressive and kind of psychopathic tendencies within the human psyche. It brought that out. They were trying to create super soldiers, guys who would get shot and not go down. BZ was one of those that came out of that. DOB and STP are both very, very, very long-lasting hallucinogens that were meant to break people's psyches. You know, you trip for 3 to 6 days, and it just completely breaks people down after a while. So some of the more famous MKUltra subjects include Ken Kesey, who was the founder of the Merry Pranksters, and this is more evidence towards this idea that this hippie kind of free, do my own thing, travel around, day-glow party archetype was actually kind of engineered out of this MKUltra thing. By the way, Ken Kesey was also hanging around with Robert Hunter and Stuart Brand, who is one of the founders of cybernetics. So all of these people connect. And you had Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. He was actually a subject in MKUltra at Harvard. And you saw what happened to him. And of course, Timothy Leary, who led a lot of it. And then in the clip that you saw, you see Timothy Leary sitting next to an old guy in an army uniform. That's Captain Al Hubbard, otherwise known as Captain Trips, otherwise known as the guy who brought LSD to this elite class of intellectuals and artists and musicians. Captain Al himself came out of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. He was a pilot for the CIA. By all intentions, he was deeply connected to MKUltra. But we don't have any actual documentation linking him to the program, so we have to just take what we have been able to derive from the evidence. So we suspect, because of the connections and the commonalities, that Mark David Chapman, the man who assassinated John Lennon, was part of MKUltra because of his connection to both World Vision, which is a CIA front. It's a global church, like an evangelical Christian church, that's used as cover by the CIA and has for at least like 40 years in conjunction with groups like the World Anti-Communist League. And so they're missionaries, travel around the world, and actually are operatives that are going under the cover of Christian missionary. And by the way, John Hinckley, who shot Ronald Reagan, he also was a member of World Vision. Chapman was in charge of a refugee camp in Oklahoma and Texas for resettled Vietnamese during the 1970s. He had gone to Beirut, Lebanon, which is a dodgy place to go in the 70s. That's where CIA, MI6, and the like used to recruit assassins. In particular, it was Beirut. It was a big terrorist training ground. So the connections go pretty wild. Then you've got Donald DeFries. He was known as Sing Q from the Symbionese Liberation Army. Jim Jones was connected through World Vision, and we'll get to him a little bit later. Charles Manson and Donald DeFries are both at Vacaville, which is a California prison that was known to have MKUltra experimentation going on. Here's just another list of other facilities, army bases and such, that MKUltra experimentation was going on. As you can tell, this is a very large program. This wasn't just a few people. This wasn't just a quirky fringe thing. This was a pretty big deal, okay? Now, this extends some people, such as the late Mae Brussell, who is one of the greatest conspiracy researchers that has been around for a long time, and much of her files and everything were inherited by the Coalition on Political Assassinations, COPA, that was run by a guy named John Judge, who unfortunately passed away this year. But COPA and Mae Brussell did a tremendous amount of work into some of this covert investigation, and I really recommend you guys look at their work. Mae Brussell's often written off as like, you know, the conspiracy queen, that she'll believe anything, she thinks everything's connected. It's because it looks like it really is. When you look at it, it looks all pretty connected to me. So her theory is that there was, you know, this thing called Operation Chaos, which is a CIA plan to essentially redirect the counterculture and then kill off all of the people that were involved in it. And so you can find it on her website, and it goes into great detail about it. Death, Drugs, and Depression, The Beautiful People. And she just kind of like asked, you know, almost all of these deaths were shrouded with unanswered questions and mystery. You know, all of these musicians were at the peak of their creative period. At the time, they were offered LSD, and then their personalities changed drastically after they were given LSD. And, you know, we have to ask, like, why would all of these people kill themselves? But because this idea of this licentious, Dionysian, hard partying rock star was already in the popular consciousness, people were able to accept that a rock star died of a drug overdose, of course. Well, I don't know, not necessarily. Let's look at one of these things. Well, Jimi Hendrix, for example, if you look at these two books here in particular, but there's also quite a bit other material, Jimi Hendrix looks like he was murdered. His manager was working with the CIA, MI6, and the FBI. In fact, his former manager even is on the record saying that he killed him. He was killed primarily because he was starting to raise money for the Black Panthers, a black nationalist organization in the United States that we saw in the first film. And it looks like he had something like 3 gallons of wine forced down his throat, which ultimately became this legend that he had taken too many drugs and had choked on his own vomit, right? The actual evidence, the police reports and everything else, the eyewitness testimony of his girlfriend who was there at the time, and even the statements of his manager all point to murder. Gets even weirder when you start talking about Bob Marley. Bob Marley, the most powerful black figure in the world after the death of Martin Luther King, the only black figure able to bring millions of people out into a demonstration or an event at a day's notice. Marley was very deeply involved in Jamaica politics, particularly the labor government of Michael Manley. The CIA had a $10 million campaign to undermine Jamaica and the Manley government. They tried to kill both of them. They tried to shoot both Marley and Manley. Both of them escaped. Bob Marley was shot. Very soon after that, Neil Bush, the son of former CIA Director George Herbert Walker Bush, the former 41st President of the United States, shows up in Jamaica to interview him, claiming he was a Rolling Stone reporter. Very soon after that, Carl Colby, the son of the former director of the CIA, William Colby, the guy who George Bush succeeded, gives him a pair of boots. Inside these boots, there was an exposed cobbler's nail. This punctured Bob Marley's toe. His toe wound never healed. Eventually, it metastasized into cancer, and he died. Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G., one thing people don't understand about Tupac is that he was the son and the nephew of former founding members and high-ranking Black Panthers. His mother, Afeni, his aunt, Assata, were key figures in the Black Panther movement. He grew up watching the first COINTELPRO infiltrate and destroy his entire community. His parents, his aunts, his uncles, all of the people that he looked up to were all destroyed by COINTELPRO, and he watched. He had a front row seat to it. As he grew up, he decided that he was going to pick up the political movements of his parents again, and of his aunts and uncles, and of the Black Panther movement. And he started making a lot of money, and he started getting a lot of influence because of the money and the public notoriety that he was getting. One thing that is not very well known is that he had brokered this very large, unprecedented truce between the Bloods and Crips street gang, and was preaching a message of unity against the white power structure that was oppressing them, and had, by this point, they were pretty well savvy on the fact that they had had all of this crack cocaine flooded into their neighborhoods as well. They knew what was going on. They were getting organized. The next year, the whole hip-hop world takes this very radical right turn. And so up until 1995, the predominant meme in hip-hop music was kind of a poetry of the streets, talking about poverty and police oppression and what it's like to live in the ghettos, and then also a lot of consciousness hip-hop, a lot of positive messaging about lifting the people up. In 1995, this thing called the East Coast-West Coast War was launched. And it turned also, the music, the hip-hop music became all about violence. It became this thing called gangsta rap, and it was all about killing each other. These things happened at the exact same time. And if you know the history of COINTELPRO from watching it in the 60s and 70s, you realize that this is the exact same program being carried out again. It is infiltrating, dividing, and conquering this movement by setting the members against each other in violent acts, by writing fake letters, by starting fake rumors. Tupac slept with Biggie's wife, blah, blah, blah. And you just take advantage of the chaos that's caused because of it. And if all of that wasn't enough, Tupac's bodyguard, Kevin Hackey, just like Fred Hampton's bodyguard, Fred Hampton was the Black Panther leader that was killed, were FBI informants. And the amount of FBI and CIA, DEA, New York, LA police that were around Tupac and Biggie is rather staggering. You know, it's, by some estimates, like half or more of the security patrol, security details on all these guys, plus, you know, possibly even Suge Knight, the owner of the record label, were all police informants one way or the other, all destroying what was going on with them. And then, of course, we look at, you know, MKUltra and this idea of the emergence of these cults like Scientology, Jonestown, Rajneeshpuram, and Burning Man. I say Burning Man tongue-in-cheek, but, you know, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so in cult psychology, what you have is L. Ron Hubbard, this guy, the founder of Scientology, the guy who wrote Dianetics. He was a member of the OSS. Anyone who's been to a Scientology center knows what the process of auditing is. Auditing is a technique of essentially interrogation that almost directly mimics what was taught in this document, the CIA document of human manipulation, otherwise known as the Kubar Counterintelligence Manual. Scientology is also run with extreme secrecy, just like the agencies. Jonestown, Jim Jones knew personally two well-known CIA agents, Richard Dwyer and Dan Matrone. Dan Matrone was murdered in South America, in Chile and Paraguay, I believe, in the mid-70s, because it was found out that he was part of Operation Condor, which is the CIA's plan with all of the military dictators in South America to infiltrate all of the organic people's movements against them, and to reinstate the democratically elected governments like Allende's. Also, Jonestown was connected to MKUltra founding scientist Lawrence Laird Layton. His kids were members of Jones's community, and there was enough pharmaceutical-grade psychotropic drugs found at Jonestown to completely kill a herd of elephants. So what was the need for all of those types of drugs? Also, World Vision ended up both selling the plot of land and taking over the plot of land that Jonestown was on. Again, World Vision is this CIA front. And then we get to Osho and Rajneeshpuram, and we have somebody who's long rumored to have been a CIA agent, going back to the 60s in the anti-communist struggle in India. The ashram was well connected to gun and drug traffickers. As you could see, all of those Uzis that they had, you don't go down to Walmart and buy Uzis, so there was a whole pipeline that came into there. And ultimately, the type of counterinsurgency tactics that were employed by the ashram to take over Washoe County, as they tried to, are classic counterintelligence programs. And then, of course, Osho is rumored to have been finally poisoned by the CIA. So, again, these facts and coincidences all point towards a picture of these being organized for three different purposes. Obviously, one, you want to, Scientology has its own purpose of using people's history against them in order to manipulate their behavior. Jonestown was this kind of like, utopian socialist community for poor blacks. Rajneeshpuram was this utopian community for bourgeois whites. And both of them were kind of infiltrated during a period where we had, by some estimates, the largest internal migration going on in the United States. So hippies and everybody was leaving the cities, leaving civilization, going off to communes, going off to groups and starting their own thing. And in come these to kind of destroy all of those notions and to say, okay, there is no utopia. You can't run away from the system. COINTELPRO also infiltrated the American Indian movement, and this arose out of a need, to enforce all of these treaties that the Native Americans had signed with the United States government. The United States government refused to acknowledge. This man is still in prison for a crime he didn't commit for life. This man's whole family was burned alive by FBI. And the actual political movement of AIM has been taken over by extremists, just like all of the reservations were taken over in the 1970s. Then you've got MOVE, which was kind of a second-generation Black Panther type community. It was an independent, autonomous African-American squat community in Philadelphia. And because they wouldn't toe the line, the police bombed their entire neighborhood. They dropped a suitcase bomb out of a helicopter, and 11 people died, 60 homes were destroyed. And this gentleman, Mumia Abu-Jamal, was a journalist who was covering a lot of the police abuses that were going on to this MOVE community. He was framed for killing a police officer and is in jail for the rest of his life. Yes, Frank? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we've heard one of the other speakers talk about Gladio. Gladio was an equally powerful network coming out of Europe, which is kind of the same thing that COINTELPRO and Chaos did in the United States. But what Gladio did was it was a secret army, a standing army of former fascists, mobsters, military operations personnel, drug dealers, arms dealers, and the like that were supposedly there to protect against communist takeover, but instead really pulled off many terrorist attacks. These are some of the groups they were known to have infiltrated, going all the way to the Occupy movement, the anti-globalization movement of today. The Red Army faction, which you may know of, the Baader-Meinhof group, was infiltrated by a guy named Karl Steinmetz. He was West German secret police, and so some of their worst crimes, some of their worst terrorist attacks are actually kind of fostered by infiltrators. And this whole story, the birth and death of the Red Army faction, kind of tells a little bit of it. The Symbionese Liberation Army looks like it was entirely fabricated. This is the people who kidnapped Patty Hearst in the 70s. This is Donald DeFries, otherwise known as Sing Q, who seems to have been involved in Vacaville and MKUltra. Ultimately, all of these people were murdered, and what ended up happening, here's a whole bunch of motives that Mae Brussell came up with as to why you would want to create this, but it was essentially to demonize completely the idea of the guerrilla army, discredit, food programs for the poor, isolate prisoners during a period of prison reform, discredit radical and leftist organizations, but the main result that came out of it is SWAT. For the first time ever, the SWAT unit was used in Los Angeles at the siege of the SLA house, where they were all burned alive. And from this point on, the government said, we need to arm all of our police officers like this because we have terrorists. And we can't let these terrorists take over, so we have to have every cop look like this. Well, today in the United States, every cop looks like this. Okay. And of course, talk about infiltrating movements. CIA was behind the Orange Revolution. Well, who do you think paid for all those lovely orange pom-poms? They were also, the Egyptian Revolution. There's a lot you weren't told about control of the Suez Canal, and both of the intelligence services of Russia, Israel, the United States, and England involved in that. The FBI coordinated the crackdown on Occupy. Everywhere you look, you see infiltration, infiltration, infiltration. Now what we have in the United States is what's known as fusion centers. All of these are different specific centers that analyze your information, your emails, your phone calls, and try to determine whether you are a terrorist assessment or not, whether you are a terrorist threat. Okay, so I'm down to my last 5 minutes here. Remember we said a post-national, multi-ethnic global society. That's what's known as the New Age culture. It has absorbed all religions and ethnicities into one, this all-one philosophy. It is connected by the internet and a common corporate brand-driven consumer culture or pop culture, cybernetic control, inherently peaceful and non-confrontational, even in the face of repression. That is that anti-authoritarian programming. And it's also connected to a multi-billion-dollar or euro or pound New Age, self-help, healing, and wellness industry. The series of slides here are from Mark Passio's What on Earth is Happening? New Age Bullshit presentation. And this basically shows how the actual psychology works, which we don't have a lot of time to go into right now, but this will be in the video. And you can look this up on Mark Passio, New Age Bullshit. All of these slides are available too. And so it goes into all these different deceptions, all these different, made up values about the New Age, and how these things aren't particularly valid, but they're meant to make us passive and pliable. Enlightenment is only about changing yourself. Truth doesn't need to be defended. You have your truth. Well, that's your truth. I have my truth. That's bullshit. There's no such thing as your truth and my truth. There is truth. There are facts. This happened, this didn't happen. There's interpretations, but there isn't your truth and my truth. So you can't choose to, for example, believe in all of this shit, which a lot of people do. Well, when you actually look behind it, what you start to find are multi-million-dollar, carefully constructed disinformation programs meant to mask military technology, super secret defense technology, information technology, and energy technology. And so instead we got aliens everywhere. So start looking at the hoax of Majestic 12 and some of the people behind here. Everything that's been in this series has been thoroughly debunked 1,000 times. I don't know why people are still talking about it, but they are. And so this whole thing they found was a whole benefit of the MKUltra program. They found that people that had rejected, the old society and thought that they had woken up and they were now, hey, I'm awake. I'm in this system. Well, they all believed in UFOs and they all liked to take psychedelics. And when they took psychedelics, they always saw UFOs. And then they found that they became obsessed with UFOs, most of these people. They followed this whole thing around for years and years and years. And they realized that these people are just looking for God. They lost their gods, they lost their angels. Now, the great white being, the great Nordic, the gray alien with the healing power, whatever, the Anunnaki who created us, they're now our gods. And it's an entirely fabricated mythology. This guy, Zecharia Sitchin, basically pulled a scam over on the entire public by very creatively interpreting some documents, some cuneiform tablets, which he didn't really actually know how to translate very well. Eventually, consortium of world scientists, linguists, based out of the University of Chicago, put the entire Babylonian dictionary up online so that you could cross-reference it and start typing in anything that Sitchin wrote in his books, and none of it pops up. Okay, so this is another gigantic distraction in my personal opinion. No one's ever seen an alien, for real. There's no pictures of them, there's no video of them, there's no communications from them, there's just channeling. We have vague pictures of things flying around in the sky. And we have people like Stephen Greer taking people out into the desert to supposedly make contact with these beings for $3,000 a pop, and nobody ever comes back with a picture or anything. So, are you awake yet? And lastly, since memes are really popular and everybody learns through Facebook, I gave you 4 of them. You can pass these around. Because the solutions are remarkably simple. People have become easier to control because they have become strangers to each other, even in their own homes. A culture of convenience is not conducive to spiritual growth. Political movements fail because they are indistinguishable from the powers they are fighting against. But it doesn't take a movement in order to be more kind and compassionate or to question your reality on a daily basis. Why do I do this? Because in an age of telling lies, an age of lies, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Thank you for your time this evening.